I never thought something as simple as a creek could turn my peaceful life into a battleground. My home was my sanctuary, a cozy, modest place nestled on the edge of our HOA community. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, and the little creek flowing through my backyard had always been a source of peace. On summer evenings, I would sit on my porch, watching the water shimmer under the sunset. It wasn't just pretty, it was part of my home's soul. That's why when the first letter from the HOA arrived, I barely paid attention to it. Violation notice, it read, printed in bold red letters across the top. I skimmed through the formal, cold language. According to them, my creek was disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic and lowering property values. I chuckled under my breath. How could a small creek bother anyone? It had been there longer than the HOA itself. But the second letter wasn't so easy to ignore. I found it tucked in my mailbox a week later, a final warning. They wanted me to resolve the issue immediately or face heavy fines. It felt absurd. I wasn't planting neon signs or building a roller coaster. It was nature. Yet somehow, the HOA president, a man named Richard Greer, had decided the creek was a problem. Richard wasn't just an ordinary neighbor. He had a reputation. With his perfectly pressed polo shirts, spotless SUV, and that ever-present clipboard, he took his position a little too seriously. I knew it wasn't really about the creek. Richard always had a reason behind his rules, and it usually involved control. My property wasn't as polished as the others in the neighborhood. I didn't have a manicured lawn with trimmed hedges or a matching mailbox. I liked things simple, organic. Maybe that's what bothered him. I decided to play it smart. I wrote a polite but firm email requesting a meeting to discuss the matter. I believed in handling things face to face. Maybe if I could explain how the creek wasn't harming anyone, we could work things out. I sent the email and waited. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Richard in the HOA's bland meeting room. He barely looked up from his papers as I tried to explain how the creek had existed long before the neighborhood. "Rules are rules," he interrupted coldly. "This isn't personal. Homeowners must maintain their properties in a way that benefits everyone." I clenched my fist beneath the table. It's a natural creek, not an eyesore. It doesn't hurt anyone. His lips curled into a tight, thin smile. Perhaps to you. But several homeowners have complained. Water attracts pests, and stagnant areas are a breeding ground for mosquitoes. We can't allow anything that devalues the properties in our community. I knew he was lying. No one had ever mentioned my creek before. It was too far from anyone else's property to cause problems. This wasn't about pests. It was about power. Despite my frustration, I tried one last appeal. "Isn't there another way? I'm willing to maintain the area or install better drainage if needed." His smile faded. "I've already made my decision. You have 30 days to block the creek. If you fail to comply, the HOA will take action." I left the meeting with a sinking feeling in my stomach. Richard wasn't going to budge. I could already imagine the trucks rolling in, dumping gravel and dirt over the water that had been part of my life for years. But if he thought I would roll over quietly, he was wrong. I wasn't about to give up my creek without a fight. A week passed, but the frustration gnawed at me every day. I tried to push it aside, telling myself it was just a creek. But it wasn't that simple. It was the principle. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values. It was about control, Richard's control, and I wasn't about to let him win that easily. I started by doing my research. If Richard wanted a fight, I needed to be ready. I pored over the HOA bylaws, spending nights with my laptop, scrolling through pages of legal jargon. It was exhausting, but I found a few things he probably hoped I wouldn't notice. Nowhere did the bylaws explicitly mention creeks or natural water features. What's more, there were no clear guidelines about environmental preservation. If anything, the HOA was skating on thin legal ice by interfering with a natural water source. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to reach out to my neighbors. If Richard claimed people were complaining, I wanted to hear it myself. So, over the next few days, I made my rounds. I knocked on doors, introduced myself to the homeowners I hadn't yet met, and brought up the creek in casual conversation. The result? Not a single person had an issue with it. In fact, most people didn't even realize it was a concern. Mrs. Thompson, who lived 3 houses down, shook her head when I mentioned the violation notice. "Honey, I've lived here 15 years. That creek's never bothered me. If anything, I think it's charming." I smiled at her words, but felt a rising anger. Richard hadn't been honest. No surprise there. This was a power play, pure and simple. And if he wanted a battle, I was ready to give him one. My next move was a formal appeal. I drafted a letter to the HOA board, outlining the lack of community concern and the absence of a bylaw addressing natural water sources. I attached copies of my research and even statements from the neighbors who supported me. I sent it certified mail to ensure it wouldn't get lost. I knew it would force their hand. Legally, they had to review my case before proceeding with any action. A week later, I got my answer. Denied. No explanation, no discussion, just a curt letter stating that my appeal had been rejected and that I had 21 days left to block the creek. That's when I realized playing fair wasn't going to cut it. If Richard wanted to flex his authority, I was about to show him I wasn't the kind of person to back down quietly. I started by making calls, lots of them. I reached out to the county's environmental agency, inquiring about protections for natural waterways. I contacted a lawyer specializing in property disputes, ensuring I understood every legal angle. I even reached out to a local news outlet, hinting at a potential story about an HOA overstepping its authority. Meanwhile, Richard wasn't slowing down. A week later, a crew arrived with heavy machinery and massive boulders, preparing to block the creek. I stood in my backyard, arms crossed, watching them unload rocks. My heart pounded with anger. He wasn't just trying to control my property. He was willing to destroy something irreplaceable just to prove a point. I snapped photos and documented every step. If he crossed a legal line, I was going to make sure there was evidence. But I wasn't just preparing for defense. I had a plan of my own. One night, after the workers left, I walked the length of the creek, flashlight in hand. I found a section of the stream that curved behind the HOA's own common area, a small park Richard prided himself on maintaining. With the right equipment, it wouldn't be hard to redirect the water there. And that was exactly what I planned to do. I hired a discreet contractor, and under the cover of darkness, we dug a new channel leading the creek right toward the HOA's private driveway. It was technically still on my land, but just close enough to spill over into the communal space. The best part? I made sure it was all legal. My property boundaries allowed me to direct water however I chose, as long as it didn't damage another homeowner's land. Since the HOA's common area wasn't privately owned by any individual, I wasn't breaking a single law. I didn't need to stop the creek. I simply needed to share it. By the time Richard realized what was happening, it was too late. The water was already flowing steadily across the HOA's meticulously paved driveway. Within days, the park's pristine landscaping was soaked, muddy patches forming everywhere. The pathway he loved to boast about? submerged. And when the HOA tried to blame me, I was ready. I produced every legal document I had collected, proof that I was within my rights. I even shared the email exchanges with the local environmental agency, which confirmed the HOA had no authority to block the creek in the first place. The cherry on top. My story caught the attention of a local news station. Within a week, they aired a segment about overreaching HOAs, featuring my case. Seeing Richard's face as the camera, crew rolled up, was pure satisfaction. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final move to make, a move Richard never saw coming. And it was going to hit him where it hurt the most. The news story spread like wildfire. Within days, neighbors who had once stayed quiet began voicing their frustrations. My bold move with the creek opened the floodgates, literally and figuratively. People who had been too intimidated by Richard's authority were now willing to speak up. And what I uncovered next would change everything. A neighbor named Kevin, who lived 2 streets over, called me the day after the news segment aired. "I've been waiting for someone to take Richard down a peg," he said, his voice buzzing with energy. "And I've got something you're going to want to see." Curious, I drove over to his house that evening. When I arrived, he led me into his home office, where stacks of HOA documents were spread across his desk. "I used to be on the board," he explained. "I resigned after Richard started pulling shady moves, but I kept records, just in case." What he showed me made my blood boil. Over the past 3 years, Richard had been quietly funneling HOA funds toward maintenance projects that conveniently benefited properties near his own home. He had hired contractors for private work and billed the HOA for it. New landscaping, a fancy security gate, none of it had been approved by the board. And while everyone else faced strict fines for minor infractions, Richard's property had multiple violations that mysteriously went unaddressed. Kevin grinned. "If this gets out, he's finished." I knew he was right, but I wasn't about to play my hand too quickly. I needed to be strategic. I spent the next few days gathering more evidence. Kevin handed over copies of the HOA's financial records, documents Richard had likely hoped no one would ever see. I compared them with the public records from the county clerk's office and found even more discrepancies. Payments had been made to companies that didn't exist. And, most damning of all, Richard had personally signed off on every unauthorized expense. With everything in hand, I prepared my next move. At the next HOA meeting, one that was more crowded than usual thanks to the publicity, I arrived early and sat quietly in the back. Richard, of course, presided at the front of the room, wearing his usual smug expression. He started the meeting with his typical agenda, reminding everyone about community standards and promising necessary enforcement against violators. I almost laughed at the irony. When the floor opened for community comments, I stood up. "I have a few questions," I began, my voice steady but firm. "Specifically about HOA funds." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Richard shifted in his seat. "This isn't the time." "I think it is," I interrupted, holding up the stack of documents. According to these financial records, over $50,000 in HOA funds have been spent on unapproved projects over the last 3 years, and every one of those payments was authorized by you. The room fell silent. Richard's face reddened as I stepped forward and began reading off specific transactions. Luxury landscaping, private repairs, a $12,000 security system installed on his property. "You've been using community funds to benefit yourself," I said plainly, "and I have the proof." He stammered, trying to regain control. These are baseless accusations. No, I cut in. These are facts, and I'm prepared to share them with every homeowner here, not to mention the county's fraud division. That did it. The room erupted. Homeowners who had been afraid to speak now found their voices. Accusations flew about fines, favoritism, and years of unchecked power. Even members of the board, clearly blindsided by the evidence, began demanding answers. And Richard? For the first time, he looked genuinely nervous. I didn't stop there. The following week, I officially filed a complaint with the county, detailing the financial misconduct. I shared the evidence with the local news station, which ran a follow-up story titled, HOA President Accused of Misusing Community Funds. The scandal shook the entire neighborhood. Under mounting pressure, Richard was forced to resign. But that wasn't the best part. After a formal audit, the HOA not only refunded every homeowner who had been wrongfully fined, but they also voted me onto the board. With Richard out, the community felt lighter. People started working together instead of living under his iron fist. And as for my creek, it stayed exactly where it belonged, flowing peacefully through my backyard. Victory was sweet, but even sweeter was knowing I had turned the tables on a bully who thought he was untouchable. And every time I heard the water trickling through the creek, I smiled, because it was the sound of justice well served. Richard's resignation didn't happen overnight. Despite the overwhelming evidence, he clung to his position like a sinking ship's captain, refusing to abandon the helm. I knew he wouldn't go down quietly. If anything, my exposé had only made him more desperate and more dangerous. The days following the HOA meeting were tense. Richard tried to spin the story, claiming I had misinterpreted the records. He sent out an official HOA email stating that the payments were necessary for the community's upkeep and accused me of spreading falsehoods to undermine neighborhood values. But the damage was done. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up were now rallying against him. Anonymous tips began flooding my inbox. Stories of how Richard had personally targeted families who opposed him. One family revealed that he'd blocked their pool renovation for over a year while approving his own patio expansion. Another neighbor confessed that Richard had threatened to fine them $500 a day if they didn't repaint their front door a shade lighter, despite no such rule existing. I knew I had to escalate things if I wanted to finish what I started. I reached out to a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. After reviewing the financial documents and the community's bylaws, he confirmed that Richard had not only violated HOA regulations, but had also potentially committed financial fraud. If these payments were made without proper board approval, that's embezzlement, the lawyer said. With his help, I filed a formal legal complaint against Richard, citing misuse of community funds and abuse of power. The county's fraud division opened an investigation, and I made sure the local news station was aware of every development. Meanwhile, I wasn't done making life difficult for Richard. With the neighborhood behind me, I started a petition demanding a special election to remove him from the HOA board. Within days, I gathered signatures from over 2/3 of the homeowners, more than enough to force a vote. Richard tried to stall, arguing that the petition was invalid, but the bylaws were on my side. And then came the final straw. One morning, I received an email from a former HOA contractor. He had seen the news and wanted to share something shocking. Richard had been using HOA funds to pay for personal construction on a property he secretly owned in the next county. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Armed with this new evidence, I sent an official letter to the HOA's management company demanding an emergency board meeting. This time, the entire neighborhood showed up. When Richard entered the community center, He tried to project confidence, but I saw the cracks in his armor. He knew he was cornered. I stood up and addressed the room. Richard has abused his position for years, but this goes beyond fines and favoritism. He's stolen from us, our money, our trust, and our community. I laid out every piece of evidence, line by line, transaction by transaction, until the weight of truth became impossible to deny. When I finished, there was silence. Then, one by one, homeowners began to speak up. They shared their own stories of harassment and unfair treatment. What had once been whispered grievances were now loud and undeniable truths. And finally, the vote came. Richard was removed from his position by an overwhelming majority. His reign of terror was over. But the best part? The county's fraud investigation eventually led to criminal charges. Richard was fined heavily and barred from serving on any HOA board again. With Richard out, I was elected to the board, this time by a unanimous vote. And the first thing I did? I overturned every ridiculous fine, reinstated the community garden, and made sure my creek remained untouched. But more importantly, I restored a sense of fairness to our neighborhood. No more petty power trips. No more corruption. And every time I walked past Richard's former home, now with a "for sale" sign on the lawn, I felt nothing but satisfaction. Justice had been served. With Richard officially removed from his position and the legal investigation underway, you'd think the drama was over. But I knew better. People like Richard don't give up without a fight, and I was prepared for his next move. For a while, things seemed peaceful. The new HOA board, led by reasonable and fair-minded neighbors, focused on undoing the damage Richard had caused. Fines were reviewed and revoked. The community garden project was reinstated. Even my creek, the original source of all this chaos, was finally unblocked. The sound of flowing water felt like a personal victory. But Richard wasn't done. Despite being stripped of his authority and facing potential criminal charges, he still lived in the neighborhood. His house, sitting on the corner lot, became a fortress of resentment. Every time I passed by, I could feel his eyes burning holes through me. It didn't take long for him to retaliate. One morning, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed to pieces. It wasn't subtle. The post was cracked in half, and the metal box itself was dented like it had been struck by a baseball bat. I knew exactly who was behind it, but without proof, there wasn't much I could do. I replaced the mailbox the same day. A week later, my trash cans mysteriously disappeared. Then came the anonymous complaints, petty reports filed with the new HOA board. My grass was too long, my porch light was too bright, and according to one report, my garden gnome was offensive to community aesthetics. It was laughable, but I wasn't laughing. Richard might not have held official power anymore, but he was determined to make my life miserable. And honestly, it was working. I was tired. I thought about giving up, about letting it all go and moving on with my life. But then I remembered something my grandfather used to say. When someone pushes you, push back harder. So I decided to push back. I started by installing security cameras. Several of them. Every angle of my property was covered. If Richard so much as sneezed near my house, I'd have it on tape. And then I got creative. I remembered the anonymous tip I had received earlier. The one about Richard using HOA funds to renovate a secret property in another county. If there was more dirt on him, I was going to find it. I spent hours combing through public records, searching for anything connected to his name. And after days of digging, I found a golden nugget. Richard owned not one, but 3 properties outside our neighborhood, One of them, a sprawling ranch-style house, was listed as agricultural land. Normally, that wouldn't mean much, except for one small detail. Agricultural properties receive massive tax breaks. The problem? Richard wasn't using the land for farming. He had converted it into a luxury vacation rental without reporting it to the county. That meant he was committing tax fraud, and I had the documents to prove it. I knew exactly where to send the information. I filed a formal report with the county assessor's office detailing Richard's fraudulent property classification. Within weeks, an official investigation was launched. And when the tax authorities got involved, things escalated fast. Richard was slapped with tens of thousands of dollars in back taxes, plus penalties for lying on his filings. His rental business was shut down, and his property lost its tax-exempt status permanently. But I didn't stop there. Using the security footage from my cameras, I compiled a detailed report of the vandalism and harassment I'd endured. I handed everything over to the local police and filed a formal restraining order against Richard. When the police knocked on his door to deliver the papers, half the neighborhood came outside to watch. It was the ultimate walk of shame, and I savored every second of it. Richard's reign of terror had officially come to an end. But my final move, that was personal. I knew Richard took pride in his status. Even without the HOA title, he still considered himself a power player. So I decided to hit him where it hurt the most, his ego. I worked with the new HOA board to organize a community block party, a celebration of the neighborhood's fresh start. We invited everyone, except Richard. When the day arrived, our street buzzed with laughter and music. Families enjoyed barbecues, kids played games, and neighbors who had been divided for years came together again. Richard? He sat alone on his porch, watching the joy he could no longer control. For the first time, his power had been stripped away, and he knew it. And as I stood there, watching my creek flow freely again, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back my peace, and I had won. For a while, life in the neighborhood felt peaceful. With Richard out of power and under investigation, things finally started to return to normal. The new HOA board was fair and transparent, undoing years of Richard's oppressive policies. My creek flowed freely again, my garden thrived, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Richard may have been defeated publicly, but I could feel his resentment lingering like a dark cloud. Every time I passed his house, I caught glimpses of him, standing on his porch, arms crossed, eyes burning with bitterness. And then, just when I thought things had settled, the real battle began. It started with small, petty nuisances. My outdoor lights mysteriously shattered one night. Then, someone began leaving anonymous complaints about my property. Things as ridiculous as my wind chimes being too noisy or my fence paint being too bright. At first, I tried to ignore it. But Richard's message was clear. He wasn't done with me. I wasn't about to let him win. I doubled down on my security. I upgraded my cameras, installed motion-activated floodlights, and even added a smart doorbell that recorded everything. If Richard wanted to play dirty, I was going to be ready. And then, one morning, I found the breaking point. I stepped outside to find my driveway blocked by two massive dump trucks. They weren't parked there by accident. These trucks, filled with gravel, were intentionally positioned to cut off my access. I couldn't get my car out, and after asking around, none of the neighbors knew who they belonged to. But I had a suspicion. I pulled up the footage from my security cameras, and there he was. Richard, standing across the street, smugly watching as the trucks pulled in during the night. He had orchestrated the entire thing. Enough was enough. I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to end this once and for all. First, I called the towing company. It took hours, but eventually the trucks were hauled away and I regained access to my property. But that was just step one. Step two? Destroying whatever power Richard still thought he had. I remembered the county's open records portal, a place where any citizen could request public documents. If Richard wanted to play games, I was going to find everything he'd been hiding. And what I found, it was worse than I imagined. Richard wasn't just manipulating the HOA, he was profiting from it. Over the years, he had quietly funneled tens of thousands of dollars from HOA fees into a personal maintenance company he owned under a shell name. Every time a resident paid a landscaping fine or a home inspection fee, that money eventually landed in his pocket. But the real kicker? He had filed fraudulent contracts with the city, claiming HOA maintenance on properties that didn't even exist. It was outright embezzlement, and I had the paperwork to prove it. I compiled every piece of evidence, every shady contract, every false expenditure, and handed it all over to both the county auditor and the new HOA board. What happened next? It was glorious. Within a month, the county filed formal embezzlement charges against Richard. Not only did he face jail time, but he was also ordered to repay every stolen dollar, plus penalties. His once pristine reputation? Destroyed. But I wasn't finished. I wanted him to feel powerless, the way he had made me and so many others feel. So with the HOA board's blessing, I bought the vacant lot next to his house. The very same lot he had once tried to fine me over when I left a garden gnome outside. And on that lot, I built a community dog park, open 24/7. Every day he had to watch neighbors and their barking dogs enjoy the very space he could no longer control. But the cherry on top, I had the new HOA board pass a rule allowing residents to decorate their properties however they wanted. And I made sure my garden gnome had front row seating, facing Richard's house. The day they hauled him away in handcuffs, I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, watching as justice was finally served. Richard had tried to block my creek, tried to control me, tried to make my life miserable. But in the end, I took everything from him, his power, his money, and his pride. And as the sound of water flowed through my creek once more, I knew one thing for sure. I had won. After Richard's arrest, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to decorate their yards how they wanted, plant gardens, or simply enjoy their homes without fear of receiving a threatening letter. His reign of terror was over, and everyone could feel it. I thought that with him gone, I'd feel an overwhelming sense of relief. And in many ways I did. But there was a strange emptiness too. For months, my life had revolved around outsmarting Richard, exposing his corruption, and reclaiming my freedom. Now that it was over, I found myself wondering, what comes next? I didn't have to wait long to find out. One morning, a knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Karen, the new HOA president, standing there with a warm smile and a clipboard. "I wanted to personally thank you," she said. "Without your determination, we never would have uncovered what Richard was doing. You didn't just save yourself, you saved the entire community." I smiled. But before I could respond, she continued. "We've been discussing a new position," she said. "A community liaison, someone who helps residents understand their rights and makes sure the HOA never abuses its power again. And we all agreed you would be perfect for the role." I blinked, caught off guard. Me? Working with the HOA after everything I'd been through? I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. But after all this, I'm not sure I'm cut out for HOA politics. Karen chuckled. That's exactly why you're the right person. You know firsthand what it's like when things go too far. We need someone like you to make sure that never happens again. Her words stuck with me long after she left. Maybe she was right. I could walk away, enjoy my quiet victory, and leave the HOA to sort itself out. Or I could stay and ensure no one else ever faced what I had. A week later, I accepted the position. And that's when I realized my battle with Richard wasn't just about revenge. It was about changing things for the better, for everyone. The first thing I did, I worked with the new board to rewrite the HOA's bylaws. Gone were the petty fines and vague rules that allowed people like Richard to abuse their power. In their place were clear, fair policies that protected both the community and individual homeowners. I also pushed for financial transparency. No more secret bank accounts or hidden fees. Every resident had the right to see where their money was going, and every expense required board approval. And as for Richard, well, karma didn't let him off easy. The county's investigation uncovered even more crimes than we initially thought. On top of the embezzlement, he had falsified permits, overcharged residents for repairs, and even tried to bribe a city official to cover it up. The judge wasn't impressed. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to repay every cent he stole, with interest. His house, the grand oversized property he had once lorded over the neighborhood, was seized to cover his debts. And in a delicious twist of fate, the person who bought it. A young couple with 3 energetic dogs who absolutely loved the dog park I'd built next door. I made sure to stop by on their moving day with a welcome basket and a garden gnome, which they proudly placed on the front porch, facing the street where Richard's car once sat. Over time, the scars Richard left on the community faded. People became friendlier, less afraid to speak up, and more willing to work together. The neighborhood transformed from a place ruled by fear to a true community where everyone had a voice. And for me, life became better in ways I hadn't expected. Without the constant stress of fighting the HOA, I had time to focus on the things I loved. My garden flourished. I even won a local award for my landscaping. The creek, once blocked, became a peaceful haven where I spent quiet evenings listening to the water flow. And best of all, I found real friendships in the people around me. The neighbors who once hid behind closed doors now invited me over for barbecues, book clubs, and weekend projects. I had fought for my home, but in the process, I had also found my place. One day, as I watered my rose bushes, Karen stopped by again. This time, she wasn't holding a clipboard. "I wanted you to know," she said. "The board voted unanimously to make the community liaison position permanent, and we'd like you to stay on." I smiled. I'd be honored. As she walked away, I took a deep breath and looked around. The sun was shining, the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and laughter echoed from the dog park next door. I had won more than just a fight. I had reclaimed my peace. Richard had tried to break me. He had tried to block my creek, control my home, and bully me into submission. But in the end, I blocked his future and built something better in its place. And every time I heard the sound of the creek flowing freely, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally, completely free.